Kiwi Ears generously provided me with a review sample of their second headphone, the Ellipse. It is an open-back studio monitor headphone equipped with 50mm dynamic drivers and a detachable cable, and I think, even now in January, we might already have the budget king of 2025. Taking some notes from Biodynamic, the Ellipse follows a very similar design formula to the DT990 and DT880. Of course, it is actually different enough in most ways to be its own thing, but I couldn't help noticing the similarities. Instead of 10cm cups, the Ellipse has 10.5cm cups, so that's something to be aware of if you enjoy pad rolling. The cups themselves are kind of semi-open, as less than 50% of the rear of the cups is actually open. But it's great to see that the vents are decorated and protect the innards with a thin, woven steel mesh. Combined with the reflective circle, I'm reminded of vinyl records and the way their grooves catch the light. The single-piece forks are attached to the cups with star hex screws, and where they go into the headband, they provide a good amount of swivel. The adjustment slider action is not too stiff, has a decent snap, and the bearing inside doesn't scratch the black coating. So far, we're off to a very good start. The plastic hardware on the headband sides is good, mostly because it, like the cups, don't have any silly rubberized coating like many other headphones and headsets around this price mark. The padding is on both top and bottom of the internal metal headband part, and while it's moderately stiff foam, I didn't experience any discomfort after several hours of use. The earpads don't have memory foam inside, but are still above average in comfort and seem to be made of similar pleather material to that found on the original Hi-Fi-Man HE500 pleather earpads. The cable is quite long, so it's definitely more for studio work rather than PC or desktop. It's also just really good functional cable, no weird memory or coiling, a synthetic fabric sheath that's just about soft and pliable enough, and some very traditional strain relief hardware, which is a bit on the uglier side, but if it does the job well, I don't care how it looks. The source end has a large 3.5mm plug with a 6.3mm screw-on adapter. After the Y-split, each cable is terminated with a 3.5mm mono plug. The clamping force can be adjusted by bending the headband, so that's what I did because I thought they were a bit too tight. The wearing comfort is great. I've always been completely fine with the large, round earpads found on Biodynamic and full-size AKG headphones, and this is no exception. In this case, I find myself automatically referring to other studio monitors, as that's what the Ellipse is marketed as being. Now, let's take a look on the inside. Firstly, we can see that there's quite a lot of tuning being done by the earpads. More on that later. In front of the driver is a piece of damping foam, which also partially hides 3 screws. The eagle-eyed among you will immediately notice that the 50mm Ellipse driver is a sibling driver to the FIO JT1. They have identical transparent frosted plastic housings, the same red mark on the magnet, one large vent and one small vent. While the JT1 driver is aluminium coated and very lightly damped, the Ellipse driver has much more damping applied directly to the vents, complemented by 3 layers of foam inside the cups, 2 of which are thicker than the first that sits directly behind the driver. Also, looking at the inside of the rear of the cups, we can see that the vents are even less open than I initially thought. I would go as far as describing these as semi-open headphones, but the same is also true for the Biodynamic DT990, which is marketed as open back, but only has a small hole in the back of the cups, so disregarding traditional semantics, I would call this semi-open. Overall, it seems most parts are somewhat serviceable, there's probably some room for modding, and everything is designed with respect to classic headphone design. It's not doing anything new or brave. This is a very safe design. First, I want to address the more abstract personalities of this headphone. Despite the semi-open back design, there is no cuppiness or seashell effect to the sound. This is likely in part due to the foam damping, which is quite heavy, and that dynamic headphones in general are more resilient to this effect than planars, for example. However, I believe the heavy damping is also responsible for creating quite an intimate sound. They don't sound very open or spacious, and while they do leak sound, I found they isolate better than most open bags, as I've had to take them off while talking to people. That intimate kind of presentation is mirrored by the imaging, which also doesn't expand vastly from left to right and stays mostly in the head. So, for a dynamic headphone, it is underperforming in that regard, but it is also about on par with the kind of imaging you get from full-sized planars like my HE500, which I was able to confirm while playing FPS video games, switching between the two. Now for the party piece. For a sub €60 headphone, these are tuned spectacularly. They have almost completely linear bass with a touch of warmth and no horrid treble peaks. But let me start by first addressing two errors in the graph. The mini DSP ears didn't do a great job with this one. While performing manual tone sweeps and listening to the headphone, the dip at 4 kHz is definitely not even close to how severe it looks on paper. Secondly, the upper treble does not roll off like that. I clearly heard a second peak at 12 kHz that plateaued for a while after, so these sound better than it looks. With that in mind, I can't think of a single other full-sized headphone under €100 that is as close to neutral as this. The only aspect of the tuning that I believe will divide the crowd is the gradual downward slope from 300 Hz to 2 kHz, which, while adding a psycho-acoustically larger soundstage and scale, also pushes some vocals and instruments a bit further back. I personally very much enjoy both presentations. When things are up front in your face, I know that it sounds more accurate and lifelike, but I can't listen to that tuning all day long. This slightly recessed type of upper mid-range tuning is exactly for all-day listening without fatigue. I wouldn't recommend rolling pads. I tried a few and almost nothing else sounded right, with even greater deviations in the mid-range. Most of the pads I own do not have the same high number of fenestrations on the underside, which is no doubt doing a lot of the tuning, so that's something to consider if you want to roll other pads. I'd like to now make a few comparisons, and while they may seem a bit ridiculous at first, please bear with me. I assure you there's a very good reason for this. Hi-Fi-Man HE500. These HE500s are modified with aftermarket velour pads that smooth the treble and improve bass performance and overall linearity. I picked this comparison because of its linear bass. Listening to Dean Town by Wolfpack, the HE500 sounds much cleaner, and the added artificial warmth provided by the Ellipse is now missing, presenting a very textured and clear sounding bass guitar. The HE500 sounds more tonally correct, more agile, clinical, and possesses a slightly more prominent treble. But when playing Get Lucky by Daft Punk, I actually prefer the Ellipse for adding warmth to the mix, which sounds more appropriate or correct for this track. In terms of subjective performance, there are definitely some situations where I would prefer the Ellipse. Sennheiser HD650. I picked this because, beside the HD600, it is the industry standard. So, listening to Eric Clapton Unplugged, the most obvious difference is just how open the HD650 sounds. The Ellipse is more closed in and slightly darker. People used to describe the HD600 series as having a treble veil. Well, the Ellipse almost has more of a thin curtain. While it sounds like a bad comparison, the Ellipse still holds its own for electronic and pop music, for which the HD650 won't be everyone's first choice for toe-tapping bass. The Altier Cal 1H. I picked this because, among all the headphones I own, it has, overall, the closest tuning to the Ellipse. Despite the Altier's sub-bass appearing to roll off significantly, there is very little difference between the two in overall tonality. The Ellipse appears to be a touch darker, and while I can hear it digging slightly deeper in the sub-bass than the Altier, it doesn't have the slam or rumble that I would have liked or indeed expected. Listening to BFG Division by Mick Gordon, I think I almost prefer the apparently less sub-bassy but more visceral attack of the Altier over the slightly compressed sound of the Ellipse. Angel by Massive Attack is another story. The deep bass kick on the Altier has a strange, almost acoustic quality to it, which actually sounds good, but I also know that is not how it should sound. Switching to the Ellipse immediately fixes that problem, bringing back the endlessly deep thump I was looking for, albeit a smidge ill-defined. In terms of staging, the Cal 1H is so much wider and more open sounding, so for me personally there is still no contest. The Altier isn't going anywhere. In the end, this was not an exercise in belittling the Ellipse, but a testament to how close it gets to great headphones while only costing a fraction of the price. Previously we enjoyed budget Studio Kings from Superlux. I think that's it. They were essentially AKG K240 clones with modern drivers, and everything else similar that came after, such as the Presonus HD7, was more expensive and equally strongly lacking in bass performance. Now we finally have a rock-solid, budget, bass-focused studio monitor headphone. If your mix sounds too warm on these, then you know for sure you've overblown it. But even if you just want these to relax and to listen to almost any type of music on a budget, there's a very good chance you'll like what you hear. In a small or student studio for under €100, you could even have the Kiwi Ears Ellipse and the Superlux HD668B, for example, and probably have a better overall set of listening tools than if you would just own one single studio monitor up to around €150. I think the AKG K612 Pro is where I would draw the line. That thing is a neutrality monster. Anyway, to summarize, the Kiwi Ears Ellipse does nothing wrong at its price. It has no flaws in its build quality, has very obviously been carefully and deliberately tuned by Kiwi Ears, and it would not look out of place in a home studio. I have no problem in giving an extremely strong recommendation to what I believe is going to be the budget king of 2025. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.